Whispers are cheap in Mayfair ballrooms, costing nothing but breath. They called Brittany a mouse, a drab, penniless little thing clinging to the corners wearing a thrice-mended gown that smelled faintly of lye soap and mothballs. They assumed she was meant to be stepped on. What the glittering lords and ladies failed to notice were her ink-stained fingers. They didn't know she held the ledgers. And they certainly didn't anticipate the day the quiet bride would bleed her vicious stepfamily dry, one calculated penny at a time. The ink on the ledger was barely dry, but the numbers were already a rotting corpse on the page. Brittany rubbed the bridge of her nose. The attic room was suffocatingly hot, smelling of hot dust and the sharp metallic tang of the cheap iron stove her stepmother allowed her to use during the winter months. It was April now, but the draft cutting through the cracked window pane carried a stubborn chill. £340. That was what Agatha had spent at Madame Delacroix's modiste in a single afternoon. Brittany stared at the figure until the ink blurred. £340 was the roof over the tenant farmers in Somerset. It was the winter coal for the entire London townhouse. It was quite literally the last of the liquid capital her late father had foolishly left in Agatha's unrestricted control. The floorboards groaned outside her door. Brittany stiffened her hand instinctively, closing over the heavy leather cover of the ledger. Brittany! Agatha's voice was a shrill scrape against the wood, followed by the rattle of the doorknob. She didn't wait for a response before pushing into the room. Agatha smelled of heavy cloying rosewater and gin. It was a smell that always made the back of Brittany's throat tighten. Her stepmother stood in the doorway, a mountain of ruched violet silk and misplaced entitlement. Behind her hovered Clara, picking at a fingernail, looking as breathtaking and vacant as a porcelain doll. "I need the draft for Delacroix," Agatha said. Not a request, a demand. She held out a plump hand, the rings cutting into her swollen knuckles. Brittany didn't move. She kept her eyes on the grain of the desk. "There is no draft, Agatha. The account at Coutts is overdrawn. If we write this note, it will bounce, and the bank will call in the mortgage on this house." Clara stopped picking her nail. "But my gown for the Danbury ball. I need it. It has silver threading. You have 6 gowns with silver threading." Brittany said, her voice flat, devoid of the tremor she felt in her chest. She hated the way her heart hammered against her ribs during these confrontations. It felt like a betrayal of her own mind. She knew she was right, but her body still prepared for a beating. Agatha took a step forward. The floorboards shrieked. "Do not speak to your sister in that tone. Clara is going to secure a duke this season. She is an investment. You—" Agatha's eyes dragged up and down Brittany's faded grey wool dress, lingering on the frayed cuffs. "Are a charity. Your father left us with nothing but debts and a dreary little bastard of a daughter who thinks she can do sums." "He left you a thriving estate," Brittany corrected softly, looking up at last. "You sold the timber. You drained the investments to buy racehorses that broke their legs. And now you are spending money that does not exist." Agatha's hand struck out. It wasn't a hard slap, just a dismissive backhand. But the heavy emerald ring on her index finger caught Brittany's cheekbone. The sharp sting radiated down to her jaw. Brittany didn't flinch. She simply turned her face back, tasting copper where she had bitten her cheek. "Write the draft," Agatha hissed, leaning in close. The gin breath was overpowering now. "Or I will sell that mare you love so much to the knacker. Write it." Brittany stared into her stepmother's bloodshot eyes. The hatred there was simple, uncomplicated. Brittany's hatred was a different beast. It was a slow, grinding mechanism. She picked up the pen. She dipped it in the inkwell. Her fingers, perpetually stained black at the tips, moved across the paper. She wrote the draft fully aware that it was the final nail in the coffin of the Linfield estate. Agatha snatched the paper, a triumphant sneer curling her lips. "Wash your face. You look like a corpse. And mend Clara's slippers. We leave for the Danbury ball at 8. They left, leaving the door ajar. Brittany sat in the quiet. She raised a hand to her cheekbone, feeling the slight swelling. She looked back down at the ledger. She wasn't going to save them anymore. Let the bank call the mortgage. Let the modiste sue them. Let them drown in their velvet and lace. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a smaller leather-bound book. This one didn't belong to the estate. It belonged to her. For 3 years, she had been skimming. A shilling here, a pound there. Falsifying the grocer's bills, shortchanging the butcher. It wasn't enough to live on, but it was enough for a carriage ticket to Edinburgh and a week's lodgings. She just needed a distraction. Something to keep Agatha busy while Brittany packed her stolen meagre fortune and vanished. She didn't know the distraction would come in the form of a Herne Wallace. The Danbury ballroom was a suffocating hell of beeswax candles, souring perfume, and the collective body heat of 300 desperate aristocrats. Brittany stood flush against the velvet-papered wall in the darkest corner she could find. Her gown was a muddy olive colour chosen by Agatha specifically because it made Brittany's pale skin look sallow. Her slippers were slightly too tight, pinching her toes with every shift in weight. She focused on the pain. It grounded her. Across the room, Clara was holding court. She wore the silver-threaded monstrosity. It caught the chandelier light brilliantly, making her look like a beacon of wealth and fertility. She has a laugh like a dying pheasant. The voice came from Brittany's left. It was low, raspy, and thoroughly exhausted. Brittany turned her head. The man standing half hidden behind the heavy velvet drape wasn't looking at her. He was staring out at the dance floor, nursing a glass of amber liquid. He was tall, but he didn't hold himself with the rigid, puffed-chest arrogance of the cavalry officers. His shoulders slouched slightly. His tailcoat was immaculate, but the cravat was tied with sloppy impatience. He smelled of rain-dampened wool and strong black tea. "I beg your pardon," Brittany said. The man took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes still fixed on Clara. "The girl in the silver. Every time Lord Hastings speaks, she lets out this squawk. It's unnatural. Does she breathe between laughs, or just stockpile the air in those enormous sleeves?" Brittany blinked. A sudden terrifying urge to laugh clawed at her throat. She swallowed it down with a dry cough. "I believe she breathes through her mouth when she smiles." The man turned his head. His eyes were a flat, unreadable grey. He looked at her olive dress, the severe bun at the nape of her neck, and the faint red bruise blooming on her cheekbone. He didn't offer pity. He just offered assessment. "You're hiding," he observed. "I am observing," Brittany corrected. "And what do you observe? That Lord Hastings' estate is heavily mortgaged, which is why he is sweating through his collar despite the draft in the room. He needs an heiress. The girl in the silver gown is wearing £300 worth of silk and lace, but the carriage she arrived in has a cracked axle, and the footmen are wearing boots with holes in the soles." Brittany looked away, staring at her own hands. "It is a room full of liars trying to rob each other." The man stared at her. The silence stretched heavy and sudden, cutting through the din of the string quartet. He shifted his weight, and Brittany noticed he favoured his left leg. A faint wince tightened the corners of his mouth. "You have a grim view of the marriage mart," he said quietly. "I have a ledger keeper's view of it," she replied. "And whose ledger do you keep?" "My own." It was a lie, but it felt good to say. The man finally pushed himself off the wall. He extended a hand. The skin was rough, calloused along the edges of the palm. Not the hands of a gentleman who spent his days playing cards. A Herne Wallace. Brittany stared at the hand. The name crashed over her. A Herne Wallace, the Duke of Westford. He had inherited the title 6 months ago after his brother died of syphilis. The gossip rag said he had spent the last decade in the north, managing coal mines and refusing to wear a cravat. They said he was rich enough to buy the crown and ill-tempered enough to burn it. She placed her hand in his. Brittany Linfield. He didn't bow. He just held her hand a second longer, then was polite, his thumb brushing the ink stains on her fingertips. "Linfield," he repeated. He looked back across the room at Clara, then at Agatha, who was currently cornering a visibly terrified Viscount. "Ah, the impoverished baron's widow. You are the stepdaughter." "The mouse," Brittany said the word slipping out before she could catch it. Aherne's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was an acknowledgement of a shared joke. Mice are quiet. They survive. Peacocks get shot and stuffed for display. He let go of her hand. Do you dance, Miss Linfield? Never. Excellent. My knee is throbbing, and if one more mother thrusts her daughter at me, I am going to set fire to the curtains. He took a step back, melting into the shadows of the alcove. Keep the ledgers, Brittany Linfield. At least numbers don't lie. He walked away, a slight limp dragging his left heel. Brittany watched him go, a strange tight knot forming in her chest. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and hadn't seen the mud on the floor. They had seen the foundation. The banging on the front door shook the plaster from the ceiling in the entryway. Brittany was in the morning room cataloguing the silver that Agatha intended to pawn by Tuesday. It was 11 o'clock the morning after the Danbury ball. Agatha and Clara were still asleep, nursing hangovers and crushed dreams as Ahern Wallace had left the ball early without dancing with a single woman. The butler Higgins, who stayed only because he was too old to find employment elsewhere, shuffled to the door. Brittany heard a low, murmuring voice in the hall, followed by Higgins dropping his silver tray. It clattered against the marble floor like a gunshot. A moment later, Higgins appeared in the doorway of the morning room. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. Miss Brittany, the Duke of Westford is in the parlour. He is asking for the lady of the house. Brittany's heart skipped a beat, then immediately settled into a cold, hard rhythm. Why would he be here? Had he found out about Clara's supposed dowry? Had Agatha managed to corner him on his way out of the ball? Wake my stepmother, Brittany said, wiping her hands on her apron. Tell her she has 10 minutes before he loses his temper. She went to the parlour herself. If he was here to ruin them, she wanted to see it. Ahern was standing by the fireplace, examining a chipped porcelain shepherdess with blatant disdain. He looked worse in the daylight. The dark circles under his eyes were bruised and heavy, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. He wore a dark wool coat that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and wet pavement. It's a fake, Brittany said from the doorway. The porcelain is a Dutch imitation painted over to look like Meissen. Ahern turned. He looked at her apron, the smudge of silver polish on her cheek, and the plain, uncorseted cotton dress she wore. He didn't look surprised. I assumed as much, he said, setting the shepherdess down. Everything in this house feels like a thin coat of paint over rotting wood. You have a charming way with compliments, Your Grace. I don't deal in compliments. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. The sheer size of him in the small parlour made the air feel thin. I deal in acquisitions and risk management. Before Brittany could pass the meaning of that, the door flew open. Agatha burst in a whirlwind of hastily pinned hair and a morning wrapper that was entirely too bright for the hour. She smelled of stale wine and sleep sweat. Clara stumbled in behind her, frantically pinching her cheeks to bring colour to them. Your Grace, Agatha breathed, dropping into a deep, wobbling curtsy. What an absolute honour. If we had known, Higgins, fetch tea, fetch the good tea. Brittany, get out of the way, you look like a scullery maid. Ahern didn't even look at Agatha. His eyes remained fixed on Brittany. Miss Linfield is fine, right where she is. Agatha blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second, before cementing back into place. Of course. Clara, darling, come sit. His Grace must be exhausted. Clara drifted to the settee, arranging her skirts and offering Ahern a vapid, breathless smile. I was so distressed you didn't stay for supper last night, Your Grace. I abhor supper at balls. The meat is always cold, Ahern said flatly. He finally turned his attention to Agatha. Madam, I am a man who despises wasting time. I have an estate in the north that requires a mistress. I have a title that requires an heir. And I have a presence in the House of Lords that requires I remain in London for 6 months of the year, away from my businesses. Agatha's eyes were practically flashing with pound sterling signs. A terrible burden, I'm sure. But a wife. A supportive, beautiful wife. She gestured frantically toward Clara. Exactly, Ahern said. I need a wife. I do not want a love match. I do not want a woman who will redecorate my manor with imported silk and demand carriage rides through Hyde Park. I want a manager. I want someone who understands the value of a pound and will not drain my coffers to impress people I actively despise. Agatha laughed a nervous trilling sound. Well, Clara is wonderfully frugal. Clara is wearing a £300 gown on the credit of a bank account that is overdrawn by £400. A hern cut in his voice like a whip cracking in the quiet room. Agatha froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her rouge looking clownish and harsh. Clara gasped a real ugly sound of panic. Brittany felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He had checked their accounts. Before he came here, he had his men look into the Linfield debts. Agatha stammered, stepping back. I don't know what you mean. We are perfectly... You are bankrupt. Ahern stated, devoid of malice. It was just a fact. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of heavy parchment. Count's Bank called in your mortgage this morning at 9 o'clock. Madame Delacroix filed a petition for debt collection at 10. Agatha swayed, clutching the back of a chair. Clara began to cry, messy tears ruining her hastily applied powder. However, Ahern continued, turning his gaze back to Brittany. I have purchased the debt from the Modiste, and I have assumed the mortgage from Coutts. The silence in the room was absolute. Brittany felt the floor tilt beneath her. She looked at the paper in his hand. Her escape plan, her little stolen fortune, her ticket to Edinburgh, it was entirely meaningless now. He owned them. Why? Brittany asked, her voice cracking. Ahern stepped forward, stopping inches from her. He looked down into her eyes, ignoring the sobbing women behind her. Because I want a wife who knows how to stretch a penny, he said softly, so only she could hear. I want a woman who hates this society as much as I do. And I want the ledger keeper. He turned back to Agatha. I will forgive the debts. I will settle a modest stipend on you and your younger daughter, enough to keep you in the country far away from London. In exchange, I am taking Brittany. Brittany! Agatha shrieked, the shock breaking through her panic. You want Brittany? She's a mouse. She's nothing. She has no dowry, no connections. She has brains. Ahern snapped, the first flash of real anger showing in his grey eyes. Which is more than I can say for anyone else in this house. He looked at Brittany. He was offering her a lifeline, but it was a lifeline made of iron chained to a man she didn't know in a marriage based on utility. It was a prison of a different name. Yet as Brittany looked at Agatha's horrified, ruined face, she felt the first intoxicating spark of power. I want the ledgers to the Northern Estates. Brittany said, her voice shaking slightly, but her chin held high. I want full control of the household accounts, and I want it in writing that they... She pointed a silver-stained finger at her stepmother. Never set foot in my home. Ahern Wallace stared at her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming the exhaustion into something dangerous and sharp. Draft the contract, Miss Linfield, the Duke said, and let us be wed. Snug against the base of her left ring finger, the gold band felt less like a piece of jewelry and more like a manacle. It was unadorned, thick, and perpetually cold. The wedding had taken exactly 14 minutes. They stood in the damp, echoing nave of St. George's, the air smelling of stale incense and wet stone. Ahern wore the same dark wool coat he had worn in her stepmother's parlour. Brittany wore a high-collared navy travelling gown, bought off the rack at a ready-made shop in Cheapside. She had refused to let Ahern pay a modiste for white silk. Silk snagged, and it stained, and she was done pretending to be something she wasn't. Now she sat in the study of the Westford townhouse on Grosvenor Square. The chair was upholstered in deep burgundy leather that sighed under her weight. The desk was a monstrous slab of mahogany. It was terrifyingly clean. Brittany ran her thumb over the smooth wood, her chest tight. There was no hot dust here. The air smelled of lemon oil, expensive beeswax candles, and the faint lingering scent of Ahern's cigars. The silence was absolute, insulated by thick plaster and heavy velvet curtains. She had spent 22 years bracing for the sound of floorboards creaking, anticipating a slap, a shout, a demand. Here the silence felt deafening. She felt like an imposter waiting for the rightful owner to drag her out by her hair. The heavy oak door swung open. Brittany flinched her shoulders, jumping up toward her ears. Ahern paused in the doorway. He caught the flinch. His eyes, that unreadable flat grey, narrowed imperceptibly. He didn't apologize for startling her, nor did he offer false comfort. He simply stepped into the room and closed the door with a soft, deliberate click, allowing her time to lower her shoulders and unclench her jaw. The steward, Mr. Harrison, has been instructed to give you the keys to the household safe. Ahern said, crossing the room to a side table holding a crystal decanter. He poured a small measure of amber liquid. He will also bring you the ledgers for the London properties and the northern mines by tomorrow morning. All of them? Brittany asked, her voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. Ahern took a sip, leaning against the edge of the side table. He crossed his arms over his chest. You stipulated full control of the accounts in the contract. I assume you intend to actually read them. Most husbands would not trust a woman with the gross tonnage of their coal yields. She pointed out, her fingers curling over the edge of the mahogany desk. Most husbands are fools who would rather their wives worry about ribbon colours, while their stewards skim 10% off the top. He stared at her, the exhaustion in his face softening into something resembling curiosity. I read the estate books from your stepmother's house, the ones I purchased from Coots. Brittany froze. Her stomach plummeted. The skimming. He had seen the falsified grocer accounts. You managed to keep a household of 3 adults and 4 servants running on an allowance meant for a small cottage. Ahern continued, his voice dropping an octave. And you successfully siphoned off exactly £82 and 4 shillings over 3 years without the bank or your mother noticing. She tasted copper. She had bitten the inside of her cheek again. I can explain. Don't. Ahern pushed off the table and walked toward her. He stopped at the edge of the desk, towering over her. He reached into his breast pocket, retrieved a heavy iron key ring, and dropped it onto the ledger book sitting in front of her. It landed with a heavy metallic clank. £82 is petty theft, Brittany. It is a rat stealing crumbs. He leaned down, placing his calloused palms flat on the wood, bringing his face level with hers. He smelled of rain and that sharp dark tobacco. You are a duchess now. If you are going to steal a railroad, do not insult us both by skimming the butcher's bill. Brittany stared into his eyes. There was no condemnation there, only a brutal, pragmatic challenge. He wasn't angry that she was a thief. He was insulted by the scale of her ambition. A slow, hot flush crept up her neck. It wasn't shame. It was an awakening. Mr. Harrison has been inflating the cost of the carriage repairs by 15%, Brittany said, her voice steady, locking her eyes with his. I reviewed the preliminary household books while you were out. He uses a Wainwright in Covent Garden, but charges you the rate of a Mayfair craftsman. Ahern's mouth twitched. That same dangerous half-smile from the parlour appeared. Is that so? I am going to fire him, she stated. He has served this house for 20 years. Then he has been robbing you for 20 years. Brittany didn't blink. I will hire a replacement by Friday, at a lower salary. Ahern straightened up, picking up his glass. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his jaw. Very well, Your Grace. Gut the staff. It's your house now. He turned and walked toward the door. Just as his hand touched the brass knob, he paused, looking over his shoulder. By the way, he said, his tone utterly casual. A letter arrived from Somerset this morning. Your stepmother. She claims the roof on the country cottage is leaking and requires a £200 advance on her stipend to fix it. Brittany felt the old familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her gut. Agatha. Even banished, she was reaching her claws out, testing the boundaries of her new cage. £200 was a fortune for a country roof. She was lying. She wanted gambling money, or silk, or gin. What did you tell her? Brittany asked, bracing herself. Nothing, Ahern replied. I threw it in the fire. If she wants money, she has to ask the person who controls the accounts. He opened the door and stepped out into the hall. Good night, Brittany. Brittany sat in the quiet study for a long time. She looked at the iron keys. She looked at the blank ledger in front of her. Then she picked up her pen, dipped it in the ink, and wrote her first letter as the Duchess of Westford. Agatha. Buy a bucket. B. Summer hit London like a wet wool blanket. The air over the Thames smelled of low tide and rotting cabbage. But inside the Pantheon Bazaar on Oxford Street, it was all rosewater and desperation. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. Brittany had spent them ruthlessly purging the Westford accounts of parasites. She had fired the steward, renegotiated the meat contracts, and consolidated Ahern's chaotic shipping investments. She dreamed in columns of ink. She was exhausted, her fingers permanently stained, but for the first time in her life, she slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. Today was her first public appearance. Ahern had insisted. "If you hide, they will smell blood," he had told her over breakfast reading the morning paper. "Let them look at you." So she walked through the arched halls of the bazaar, Ahern's heavy hand resting warmly at the small of her back. She wore dark green velvet too heavy for the season, but it felt like armor. The whispers followed them like rustling dry leaves. "The charity case. I heard he bought her for £1. Look at her hair so severe, a penniless mouse." Brittany kept her chin level. She let the words wash over her. They were right, of course. She was a penniless mouse, but she was a mouse sitting on a mountain of their debt. "Stop gripping your reticule so tightly," Ahern murmured, leaning in close. His breath ghosted over the sensitive skin of her ear. "You look as though you are preparing to bludgeon the Viscountess of Althorpe." "The Viscountess of Althorpe owes your estate £4,000 in gambling markers," Brittany whispered back, her lips barely moving. "I am debating whether to bludgeon her with the reticule or simply call in the markers." Ahern let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh. "Save it for Tuesday. Today we just walk." They didn't get far. Near a stall selling imported lace, the crowd parted. Brittany felt the muscles in Ahern's back tighten beneath his coat. She followed his gaze, and her stomach immediately turned to lead. Agatha and Clara were standing in the middle of the aisle. They were supposed to be in Somerset. The contract explicitly forbade them from entering London during the season. Yet here they were. Clara was wearing a new gown of pale pink organza. Agatha looked flushed, her eyes darting nervously toward the society matrons, watching the unfolding scene with naked hunger. Agatha stepped forward, clasping her hands together in a pantomime of maternal joy. "Brittany, darling." Agatha's voice was pitched loud enough to carry to the back of the hall. She practically threw herself at Brittany, enveloping her in a suffocating cloud of cheap lilac perfume. Brittany stood rigid, her arms pinned to her sides. The smell brought a flash of nausea, a sudden memory of the cold attic, and the sting of an emerald ring against her cheek. She fought the urge to step backward. Agatha pulled away, gripping Brittany's forearms hard enough to bruise through the velvet. "Oh, we missed you so terribly in the country. We simply had to come to town to see how you were faring in your new situation." Agatha shot a sycophantic, terrified smile at Ahern. "Your Grace, you look well." Ahern said nothing. His face was carved from granite. He looked at Agatha the way one looks at a beetle struggling on its back. "What are you doing here, Agatha?" Brittany kept her voice low, freezing the fake smile on her stepmother's face. "We are family, darling." Agatha hissed, her grip tightening. "And we are staying. Lord Hastings has shown an interest in Clara, but we need lodgings. You will put us up in the townhouse. It is the least you can do after stealing my daughter's dowry to pay off that brute." She nodded toward Ahern. Brittany looked at Clara. The girl was shrinking behind her mother, looking miserable and terrified. Then she looked back at Agatha. The woman was desperate. The country allowance wasn't enough to fund her vanity, and she was trying to force Brittany's hand in public, assuming the new Duchess would avoid a scandal at all costs. She assumed wrong. Brittany gently, deliberately peeled Agatha's fingers off her arms. She smoothed the velvet of her sleeves. She could feel the entire bazaar holding its breath. "Agatha," Brittany said, her voice clear and carrying perfectly in the sudden quiet. "I believe you are confused. You do not have a daughter with a dowry. You have a daughter with a mother who forged her late husband's signature to secure loans from moneylenders in Cheapside. Agatha's jaw dropped. The rouge on her cheeks suddenly looked like clown paint against her pale skin. "How dare you?" "I dare." Brittany cut her off, her tone devoid of anger, entirely flat and lethal. "Because I spent yesterday morning reviewing the personal ledgers you left hidden beneath the floorboards in the morning room before you were evicted." A collective gasp echoed from the eavesdropping aristocrats. "You owe Mr. Finch the butcher £80. You owe the gin distiller in Southwark 120. And you owe a Mr. Silas Craig, a rather unsavoury gentleman who breaks thumbs for a living, nearly £500. Brittany took a step closer to her stepmother. The smell of lilac couldn't mask the sour tang of Agatha's sweat. "Ahern paid the estate debts. He did not pay your personal vices." Agatha was trembling now, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. You cannot say these things. We will be ruined. Clara is ruined because of you," Brittany stated. She didn't feel triumph. She just felt tired. It was like putting down a rabid dog. It was necessary, but ugly. "The contract stipulated you remain in Somerset. Because you broke it, your stipend is suspended for 3 months. You little bitch!" Agatha spat, the genteel facade crumbling completely, revealing the vicious, cornered animal underneath. She raised a hand, the heavy emerald ring flashing in the light, aiming for Brittany's face, just as she had in the attic. Brittany didn't flinch this time. She didn't need to. Before Agatha's hand could complete the arc, Ahern's large, calloused hand snapped out, catching Agatha by the wrist. The sound of his grip connecting with her bones was a dull, sickening thud. Agatha shrieked, dropping to her knees as Ahern twisted her wrist just a fraction of an inch. "Touch my wife again." Ahern set his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the hair on the back of Brittany's neck stand up. "And I will buy the debt from Mr. Craig, and I will collect it myself." He let go. Agatha scrambled backward on the floor, clutching her wrist to her chest, sobbing openly. Clara was weeping into her hands, unable to look at anyone. Ahern calmly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his hand, and tossed the linen onto Agatha's lap. He turned to Brittany, offering his arm as if they were merely strolling through a park. "Are you finished auditing the streets of London, Your Grace?" He asked, his grey eyes alight with a dark, feral satisfaction. Brittany placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the steady, solid heat of him through his coat. The knot in her chest was completely gone. In its place was a cold, bright clarity. "For today," Brittany said softly. They walked away, leaving the vicious stepmother weeping on the floor of the Pantheon Bazaar, the whispers of the ton shifting from mockery to absolute shivering terror. The penniless mouse had teeth, and she had married the wolf. Ink smudged the edge of Brittany's right cuff, a dark, jagged smear against the crisp white linen. She didn't bother to roll it up. The clock in the corner of the study ticked past 2 in the morning, a rhythmic, hollow sound that seemed to sync with the dull throbbing behind her eyes. Spread across the mahogany desk were the ledgers for the York coal mines. They smelled of damp parchment and the heavy, earthy odour of the northern hills. Brittany dragged her index finger down a column of expenses for the 3rd time. Her eyes burned. The numbers were neat, written in a tight professional hand by a Mr. Gable, the mine's primary overseer. They were too neat. The floorboards in the hallway groaned. Brittany didn't flinch this time. She knew the cadence of that uneven footstep. The study door pushed open. Ahern stood in the threshold, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He wore loose trousers and a linen shirt unbuttoned at the throat, lacking the rigid layers of his daytime armour. His hair was ruffled, falling over his forehead, and the deep lines framing his mouth looked carved from shadow. He looked his age tonight, a man who had carried too much weight for too long. "You are going to burn out your eyes," he said. His voice was thick with sleep and the rasp of a dry throat. "The cost of pit props doesn't align with the tonnage," Brittany replied, not looking up. She tapped the page. "Mr. Gable is claiming he purchased timber to reinforce 3 new shafts in April, but the yield reports from May and June show a decrease in coal extraction. You don't build new shafts to mine less coal." Ahern pushed off the doorframe. He moved slowly into the room, favoring his left leg more than usual. He didn't go to the liquor cabinet. Instead, he pulled up a heavy leather chair beside hers and sat down heavily. He smelled of clean linen and the faint, musky scent of sleep. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his shoulder brushing against hers. The heat of him seeped through her sleeve. Gable has managed the York pit since my brother was alive. He's a sour bastard, but he knows coal. He knows how to steal, Brittany corrected softly. She flipped back 3 pages. Look at the invoices for the Canaries. He claims they are buying 50 birds a month due to foul air. But the mortality logs reported by the pit bosses only list 10 deaths. Ahern stared at the ledger. He didn't blink for a long moment. Then a low, humorless chuckle vibrated in his chest. He is invoicing us for ghost birds. He is inflating the operational costs by 20%. Brittany said, her stomach twisting. It wasn't the petty theft of a grocer's bill. This was thousands of pounds. And the surplus capital is being routed to a secondary account at a provincial bank in Leeds. Ahern turned his head. His face was mere inches from hers. She could see the dark flecks in his grey eyes, the uneven texture of the skin along his jawline where he had scraped himself shaving. He wasn't looking at the ledger anymore. He was looking at her mouth, then up to her eyes. Why are you doing this at 2 a.m, Brittany? Because I couldn't sleep. Why? Brittany looked down at her ink-stained fingers. The truth sat heavy and uncomfortable on her tongue. She was used to lying to survive. Telling the truth felt like stepping off a cliff. Because I am waiting for the floor to drop. Ahern's brow furrowed. Explain. I have a home. I have a fire that doesn't smell of cheap iron. I have authority. She swallowed hard, the muscles in her throat working. I spent my life balancing ledgers to keep a roof over my head, knowing that at any moment Agatha could rip it away on a whim. Now I'm sitting in a duke's study finding thousands of pounds in theft. It feels precarious. It feels as though I'm playing dress-up and eventually the real owner will come home and punish me for touching his things. Ahern didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she was safe or that she belonged. He reached out and wrapped his large, rough hand over hers, trapping her ink-stained fingers against the open ledger. His grip was firm, anchoring her to the wood. The York mines belong to you, Ahern said, his voice dropping into a quiet, absolute register. The debts belong to you. The money belongs to you. You are not a guest in this house, Brittany. You are its foundation. He rubbed his thumb over the dark ink on her knuckle. The friction sent a sharp, involuntary shiver down her spine. Now, Ahern continued, his eyes darkening as he looked back at the book. Where exactly is this secondary account in Leeds routing our money? Brittany let out a breath she hadn't realised she was holding. She used her free hand to pull a smaller piece of parchment from beneath the ledger. I telegraphed the bank manager in Leeds yesterday morning. The funds are being drawn out by a proxy to pay off gambling markers. Who's Lord Hastings? Ahern went perfectly still. The warmth of his hand remained, but the energy radiating from him turned instantly lethal. Lord Hastings. The man Agatha had been desperately trying to secure for Clara. The man whose estate was heavily mortgaged, sweating through his collar at the Danbury ball. Hastings is using my coal to fund his pharaoh habit. Ahern murmured the words, tasting like gravel. And Gable is facilitating it. Gable's daughter is married to Hastings' estate manager, Brittany added. It is a closed loop of theft. Ahern finally let go of her hand. He sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence stretched heavy with the promise of violence. When he finally looked back at her, his expression was hollowed out, cold and predatory. Send for them, Ahern said. Send a carriage for Gable and a formal invitation to Hastings. Tell them we are discussing a joint investment. And when they arrive, Brittany asked, her heart hammering against her ribs, that terrifying, intoxicating rush of power flooding her veins. When they arrive, Ahern said, a grim, jagged smile touching his lips, you are going to gut them. Morning light exposed every flaw in the study, highlighting the dust motes dancing above the desk and the harsh lines of anxiety on Lord Hastings' face. The clock chimed 11. Brittany sat in the high-backed burgundy chair. She wore a severe gown of dark charcoal wool, the collar buttoned tightly to her throat. She looked exactly like the impoverished mouse of Mayfair, save for the heavy gold band on her left hand and the stack of damning paperwork resting beneath it. Ahern stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the rain-slicked pavement of Grosvenor Square. He had refused to sit. He wanted them to feel his presence, not his hospitality. Lord Hastings sat rigidly on the edge of a guest chair, smelling of Sour Bay rum and stale sweat. Next to him sat Mr. Gable. The mine manager was a thick-necked, ruddy-faced man who kept wiping his palms on his trousers. He looked at Brittany with open, naked contempt. "I confess, Your Grace." Hastings stammered, addressing Ahern's back. "I am a bit confused as to why the Duchess is presiding over a meeting of men's business." Ahern didn't turn around. "The Duchess controls the accounts, Hastings. I merely dig the holes." Gable sneered, a wet, ugly sound. "With respect, Your Grace, the York pits are complicated. It takes a man who understands the earth to manage the books, not a woman who learned her sums counting tea leaves." Brittany didn't react. She let the insult hang in the air, allowing it to curdle. She picked up a single sheet of paper and slid it across the mahogany surface. "I understand the earth perfectly well, Mr. Gable." Brittany said, her voice entirely flat. "For example, I understand that timber rots. I understand that canaries die, but I do not understand how 50 birds a month can vanish into thin air, nor how you can reinforce 3 new shafts without extracting a single ounce of additional coal." Gable's ruddy face lost a fraction of its colour. The air has been foul. The damp rots the wood faster than... You have been inflating the operational budget by 20% for 3 years. Brittany cut him off, tapping the paper. "You routed the surplus to the Leeds Provincial Bank under the name of your son-in-law." Hastings jerked in his seat as if he had been struck. "Now see here, this is a wild accusation." "Shut up, Hastings," Ahern said softly from the window. He still didn't turn around. Brittany slid a second piece of paper across the desk. "This is a record of debt from White's Club in St. James. £4,000 in gambling markers signed by you, Lord Hastings. Paid in full last Thursday by a draft from the Leeds Provincial Bank." She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the desk. "You are running your estate into the ground. You tried to secure my stepsister, assuming she had a dowry to float your debts. When that failed, you leaned heavier on Gable to bleed my husband's minds. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rain lashing against the window pane. Hastings looked like a man watching the gallows being built. Gable's jaw was clamped shut, a vein pulsing frantically in his thick neck. "It's a clerical error," Gable forced out, his voice cracking. "A misunderstanding of the proxy accounts. I can explain." "You are fired, Mr. Gable," Brittany stated. "You have until sundown to vacate the manager's cottage at York. If you attempt to take so much as a silver spoon from the property, I will hand these ledgers over to the magistrate, and you will hang for embezzlement." Gable opened his mouth, looked at Ahern's broad, unmoving back, and snapped it shut. He stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor, and stormed out of the room without a word. Hastings remained looking small and deflated. He reached a trembling hand up to loosen his cravat. "Your Grace," he whispered to Brittany, "I am a peer of the realm. If this gets out, I am ruined. The creditors will seize my ancestral home." "Yes," Brittany agreed. "They will. I beg of you, give me time. I can repay the 4,000. I can arrange a marriage with the Carlisle heiress." "I don't want your money, Lord Hastings," Brittany said. She gathered the papers, tapping them neatly against the desktop. "I want your markers." Hastings blinked, confusion briefly overriding his terror. "My markers?" Ahern finally turned from the window. He walked slowly across the room, stopping directly behind Brittany's chair. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. The heat of him grounded her against the sudden surge of nausea twisting in her gut. Ruining men was ugly work. "My wife has purchased your remaining debts from your creditors in the city," Ahern said, his voice entirely devoid of mercy. "We own the mortgage on your London townhouse and the deed to your country estate." "But why?" Hastings gasped. Because you conspired to rob my family, Ahern said softly. And because my wife is cleaning house. Brittany looked at the broken man in front of her. She thought of Agatha desperate and cornered, realizing that her final lifeline Hastings was now a puppet dancing on Brittany's strings. Agatha would have nowhere to run, no one to borrow from. She was entirely irreversibly isolated. You will return to your country estate, Lord Hastings. Brittany instructed, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline shaking her hands under the desk. You will live on a strict allowance that I will dictate. You will not gamble. You will not attempt to marry an heiress. You work for the York Mines, now paying off your debt at 5% interest. If you deviate from this, I will call in the mortgage, and you will sleep in the Fleet prison. Hastings looked at her. He didn't see a mouse anymore. He saw a trap that had already snapped shut around his throat. He nodded once, a jerky, humiliating motion, and dragged himself out of the room. When the door clicked shut, the silence rushed back in. Brittany exhaled a long, shaky breath, letting her rigid posture collapse against the back of the chair. Her hands were trembling visibly now. She pressed them flat against the cold mahogany to stop them. Ahern moved around the desk. He didn't speak. He poured a small glass of brandy, brought it to her, and placed it in her shaking hands. Drink, he ordered gently. She took a sip. It burned like fire, settling the cold nausea in her stomach. She looked up at him. It doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like butchery. Ahern leaned down, resting his hip against the edge of the desk. He reached out and pushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was startlingly tender against the brutal reality of what they had just done. Survival usually is, Ahern said quietly. But you kept the house standing. That is all that matters. Autumn stripped the trees in Hyde Park, bare, leaving behind a skeletal lattice of branches against an iron-grey sky. Inside the Westford townhouse, the air was warm, smelling of roasted chestnuts and beeswax, but Brittany still felt a phantom chill clinging to her collarbones. The disturbance did not happen at the grand front entrance. It started as a muffled scuffle in the scullery, followed by the sharp crash of breaking crockery. Brittany was in the kitchen checking the weekly inventory with the new cook, Mrs. Higgins. She paused, setting her pen down on the flour-dusted butcher block. The heavy oak door leading to the alleyway burst open, bouncing off the stone wall with a crack that made the kitchen maids shriek. A woman stumbled over the threshold. For a fraction of a second, Brittany didn't recognize her. The figure was gaunt, wrapped in a moth-eaten woolen shawl that smelled aggressively of cheap gin-wet dog and desperation. Her hair, once rigidly pinned and dyed, a vibrant auburn hung in lank, greying strips around her hollow cheeks. "I need to see her," the woman shrieked, her voice a ragged tearing sound. She lunged forward, her hands clawing at the air. Two burly footmen grabbed her by the shoulders, dragging her back. The woman fought like a feral cat, kicking her scuffed, mud-caked boots against their shins. It was Agatha. Brittany stood perfectly still. The kitchen fell into a deathly silence, broken only by Agatha's ragged panting and the bubbling of a heavy iron stockpot on the stove. "Let her go," Brittany commanded softly. The footmen hesitated, exchanging a wary glance, but they released their grip. Agatha stumbled forward, catching herself on the edge of the large wooden table. She looked at Brittany. The hatred in her bloodshot eyes was still there, but it was buried under a thick, suffocating layer of panic. She had been cut off for 3 months. Lord Hastings was a prisoner of his own debts, terrified of Ahern's wrath. Mr. Craig, the Cheapside moneylender, had undoubtedly lost his patience. Agatha had nowhere left to hide. "You," Agatha rasped, pointing a trembling finger with a jagged, dirty nail. The heavy emerald ring was gone, pawned or stolen. "You did this. You starved your own mother." "You are not my mother," Brittany replied. Her voice didn't waver. She felt a profound, heavy emptiness in her chest. She had expected this moment to feel like triumph. Instead, it just felt pathetic. "And you starved yourself, Agatha, the moment you broke the contract." Agatha let out a dry, hacking sob. She collapsed onto a wooden stool, burying her face in her hands. The shawl slipped from her shoulders, revealing a stained, threadbare bodice. They took Clara. She wept the words muffled. Mr. Craig's men. They came to the boarding house in Southwark. They said she could work off the debt in a house in Covent Garden. She's terrified Brittany. She doesn't know how to wash her own stockings, let alone. Agatha looked up her face, a mask of absolute ruin. Please, I am begging you. Let me rot. Let me starve. But buy Clara's debt. You have millions. What is £500 to a duchess? Brittany stared at the woman who had slapped her, humiliated her, and used her father's memory as a footstool. A part of her, the wounded penniless mouse locked in the attic, screamed to turn her back, to let the velvet trap close completely. But Brittany was no longer the mouse, and she was not an abuser. Get up, Brittany said, her tone sharp, cutting through Agatha's theatrics. Agatha blinked her tears, pausing. Mrs. Higgins, Brittany instructed, not taking her eyes off her stepmother. Fetch a basin of hot water and lye soap, and bring the ledger for the discretionary fund. Brittany walked around the table, stopping a few feet from Agatha. The smell of gin was overpowering, turning Brittany's stomach. I will buy Clara's debt. Brittany said the words falling like heavy stones. And I will purchase 2 tickets on the morning coach to Cornwall. There is a small cottage there owned by the estate. It is stone, it is draughty, and you will have to light your own fires. Agatha's chest heaved. Cornwall, but the society. There is no society, Agatha. Brittany snapped, the raw, unpolished anger finally breaking through her calm facade. You are done. You will receive an allowance of £2 a week paid directly to the local grocer and the butcher. You will never see a physical coin. You will never set foot in London again. If you attempt to contact me, or if Clara attempts to contact a gentleman of the ton, I will cut the line completely, and Mr. Craig can have you both. Do you understand me? Agatha shrank back, the last spark of her aristocratic arrogance extinguishing, leaving behind nothing but ash. She nodded, her chin trembling. Yes, I understand. Scrub your face, Brittany ordered, turning her back on the broken woman. You smell like a corpse. She walked out of the kitchen, her boots clicking sharply against the stone floor, her spine rigid. She made it all the way to the main hallway before her knees gave out. She caught herself on the mahogany banister of the grand staircase, her knuckles turning white. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the sudden violent tremor shaking her shoulders. It was over. The tumour was finally excised, but the surgery had left a gaping bloody hole. Breathe. The voice was rough, quiet, and right behind her. Ahern's large hands clamped down on her shoulders. They were heavy, warm, and entirely steady. He stepped in close behind her, his chest brushing her back. He smelled of rain and dark tobacco, a scent that instantly bypassed her panic and anchored her to the floorboards. I handled it, Brittany whispered, her voice cracking. I know, Ahern said. He didn't ask if she was all right. He knew she wasn't. My men are already on their way to Covent Garden to retrieve Clara, and the carriage to Cornwall is arranged. Brittany opened her eyes, staring at the polished wood of the banister. You knew she was coming. I have had men watching her since the bazaar. Ahern murmured, his thumbs slowly rubbing the tense muscles at the base of her neck. I wanted to ensure she didn't try to bring a knife to the front door, but I knew you had to be the one to finish it. You had to close the ledger yourself. Brittany let out a long, ragged breath, sagging back slightly against his solid frame. It doesn't feel good. It never does. He replied, his voice a low rumble against her spine. Power is just a different kind of burden. Midnight found them in the study, the fire dying down to glowing embered ruins in the hearth. The desk was clear for the first time in months. The ledgers were stacked neatly on the shelf. The accounts balanced, the parasites purged. The Westford estate was a fortress of iron and gold, and Brittany was its undisputed architect. She sat in the burgundy leather chair, a glass of dark port warming in her hands. She wore a simple dressing gown of deep emerald silk, a gift from Ahern that she had initially balked at until she felt how it didn't scratch her skin like the coarse wool she was used to. Ahern sat in the chair opposite hers, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. He was watching her in the dim light, his grey eyes dark and unreadable. "The York yields are up," Ahern noted, breaking the comfortable silence. Without Gable siphoning the funds, the new pit props were installed. "The men are digging faster." "Good," Brittany murmured, taking a small sip of the sweet, heavy wine. "I plan to redirect the surplus into purchasing 3 new steam engines for the northernmost shafts before winter sets in." Ahern smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed expression that erased a decade from his face. "You are relentless, Your Grace." "I am efficient," she countered. Ahern set his glass down on the side table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the physical distance between them. "You are more than that, Brittany." She looked at him, feeling the familiar sudden tightening in her chest. But it wasn't the panic of an anticipated blow. It was the terrifying vulnerability of being truly seen. Ahern reached out and gently took the glass from her hands, setting it next to his own. He took her hands in his. Her fingertips were as always stained with a faint shadow of ink. He didn't ignore it. He traced the dark smudges with his thumb, his calloused skin, rough against hers. "I bought a ledger keeper," Ahern said quietly, his voice dropping into that low, intimate register that made her breath catch. "I wanted a manager. Someone cold, calculating and cynical." "And you got one," Brittany whispered. "No," he disagreed, looking up from her hands to meet her gaze. "I got a woman who balanced an empire while bleeding for a family that hated her. I got a woman who ruined a vicious man without blinking but bought a train ticket for the monster who starved her. You aren't cold, Brittany. You are just careful." He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. The emerald silk pooled around her ankles. She was tall, but he still dwarfed her, an immovable mountain of a man who had chosen to stand between her and the world. He didn't pull her into a desperate theatrical embrace. He simply cupped her face in his large hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones right over the spot where Agatha's ring had bruised her all those months ago. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of. "The contract said you wanted control of the house," Ahern murmured, stepping closer, until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You have it." "But what do you want from me?" Brittany looked up into his grey eyes. She saw the exhaustion he carried, the cynical armour he wore to survive the ton, and the quiet, steady loyalty he had given her since the day he handed her the keys to his safe. She didn't want a saviour. She wanted a partner. She reached up, her ink-stained fingers wrapping around his thick wrists. "I want you to stop favouring your bad leg when you think I'm not looking," she said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "I want you to drink your tea before it goes cold, and I want you to stay right here." Ahern's chest hitched with a silent laugh. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "That sounds like a terrible bargain for you, Duchess." "I will write it into the ledger tomorrow," Brittany breathed. When he kissed her, there was no hesitation. It was a claim solid and real, tasting of port wine and dark tobacco. It was the feeling of a heavy door finally locking into place, shutting out the cold, the whispers and the ghosts of Mayfair forever. Brittany kissed him back, her hands sliding up to grip the lapels of his coat. She was no longer the penniless mouse clinging to the corners of the room. She owned the room. She owned the ledgers. And she owned the heart of the wolf. If you felt the vindication of Brittany's brilliant revenge and the slow burn intensity of her romance with the Duke, you won't want to miss our next story. Hit that like button if you love a heroine who uses her brains to conquer her enemies. Share this video with fellow historical romance fans, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Tell us in the comments, what was your favourite moment of Brittany's revenge? See you in the next tale of scandal and triumph.